Welcome back to the Bedtime Lore. Tonight, we drift gently across centuries and oceans to a place that once shimmered like a dream upon the surface of a vast highland lake. A place where cities floated on water, where gardens bloomed from the mud of the shallows, and where the soft dip of a wooden paddle was the most common sound of morning. We are journeying to the Valley of Mexico, to the quiet waters and the patient green fields of Tenochtitlan, the island capital of the people who called themselves the Mexica. Our story takes place long before the highways and the tall buildings, long before the stone was ever broken to build a Spanish cathedral. It begins in the soft centuries before 1519, when the lake was still whole, still wide, still breathing with reeds and birds and the slow rhythm of human hands. So settle in now. Loosen the blanket at your shoulder. Let your breath slow to the pace of water moving beneath a canoe. Close your eyes if they are not already closing, and let the room around you soften. Tonight there are no battles to recount, no storms to weather. There are only the chinampas, the floating gardens, drifting on their still canals. There are only farmers lifting seedlings from their beds of reed, and merchants gliding home at dusk, and children trailing their fingers in cool water as their grandmothers hum the songs of the harvest. Let the slow, green world of the Aztec lake rise around you, and let its quiet, ancient rhythm carry you softly, gently towards sleep. Before there was a city upon the water, there was only the lake itself, and the lake was enormous. It filled the bowl of the valley between the great volcanoes, cradled at more than 2,000 meters above the sea, held by the ancient mountains of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, and the dozen lesser peaks that ringed the basin like the rim of a shallow cup. In the old days, the valley gathered every drop of rain that fell upon its slopes, and every spring that rose from its hidden places, and it poured them all into a great interlocking body of water. There was Lake Texcoco at the center, the largest and the saltiest, because it lay at the lowest point and had no outlet. There was Lake Xochimilco to the south, fed by cold, clear springs, and Lake Chalco beside it, and the smaller bodies of Xaltocan and Zumpango to the north. But in truth, the waters all blended together, rising in the wet season and shrinking in the dry, touching one another through marshes of tule reed and willow. Into this watery valley, many peoples came and went across the long, slow centuries. There were farmers who lived along the hills and the fertile southern shores, and there were fisherfolk who knew every cove and every patch of bulrush. There were traders who paddled between them in low dugout canoes, carved from single logs of cedar or ahuhuit. And it was these earlier peoples, the farmers of the southern lakes, who first learned the secret that would one day define the valley. They learned how to build a garden upon the water. No one is entirely certain when it began. The earliest chinampas that can be dated with confidence belong to a time around the 12th century, though the practice was surely older than that. Somewhere along the quiet edges of Xochimilco or Chalco, some farmer, perhaps watching how the reeds themselves trapped mud and leaves and slowly built up little islands of their own, had an idea. And from that idea, everything that followed would eventually grow. The Mexica, who would later become the great builders of chinampas, were not there in the beginning. They came late to the valley, long after the first gardens had been laid out in the southern lakes. The Mexica were wanderers, a people who had come from a distant northern place called Aztlan, who had walked for generations following the guidance of their patron deity. They arrived in the valley around the 13th century and found every good piece of land already claimed. They were pushed from place to place until at last, according to their sacred tradition, they received a sign upon a small swampy islet in the middle of Lake Texcoco. They saw an eagle perched upon a prickly pear cactus, and they understood that this was the place promised to them. It was not much of a promise. The islet was low, reedy, brackish, and often half underwater. It was the kind of place that nobody else had bothered to take. But the Mexica settled there in the year that later generations would remember as 1325, and they began the slow work of turning a marsh into a home. At first, there was hardly any dry land to speak of. The Mexica looked to what their southern neighbors had done, and they adapted it. They drove wooden stakes into the shallow lake bed. They wove mats of reed and willow and bulrush between the stakes. And they scooped mud from the bottom of the lake and piled it into the frames they had made, layer upon layer, until a new patch of land rose just above the water. Upon that patch, they planted willow saplings at the corners, and the roots of the willows grew downward through the soft mud and gripped the lake floor like anchors, holding the new earth in place. Then they built their houses upon some of these new islands and planted their maize and beans upon others and dug narrow canals between them. And slowly, softly, a city began to take shape upon the water. This patient building went on for generations. The Chinampas spread outward from the original islet like the rings of a slow-moving pond. By the time the city was a century old, the Mexica had turned their little swampy foothold into a proper metropolis, crisscrossed with waterways and studded with whitewashed houses and painted temples. They gave their city a name, Tenochtitlan, meaning the place of the cactus on the stone. And all around it, in every direction, stretched the water, glinting softly in the highland sun, alive with water birds and fish and the endless quiet movement of canoes. Let us begin in the quietest hour of the day, the hour before dawn, when even the great city of Tenochtitlan lay still. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a chinampa somewhere near the southern canals, where the fresh water from Xochimilco meets the gentler edges of the city. The sky above is the deep, soft indigo that comes just before the first light, and the stars are still visible, though they have begun to fade. A thin mist rises from the water, drifting in slow ribbons between the willow trees. You can hear the faint clicking of a grebe somewhere in the reeds, and the far-off call of a heron settling its wings. Otherwise, there is only silence and the soft lap of water against the edge of the garden at your feet. A chinampa in the hour before dawn is a peaceful thing to behold. The plot is narrow, perhaps 6 to 10 meters wide, and long, perhaps 100 meters or more. Its surface rises just a little above the water, high enough to keep the roots of the crops dry, low enough that the water from the canal can seep in from beneath and feed them. Along the edges, the willow trees stand as old friends, their roots braided deep into the mud, their soft gray leaves trembling in the faintest breath of morning. The earth of the Chinampa is dark and rich, almost black, made from layer upon layer of lake mud and rotted reed, and the gentle gift of organic matter. It smells faintly sweet, like wet leaves in a forest after rain. Across it, in careful rows, grow the crops that have fed this city for generations. Maize stands tallest, its leaves silvered with dew. Beans climb the maize stalks, twining upward in a patient partnership that the farmers have understood for longer than memory. Squash spreads its wide leaves across the lower ground, shading the earth and keeping the moisture close. This is the famous threesome that Mesoamerican people have called the Three Sisters. Between the rows, there are other things growing as well. Tomato plants, their green fruits still small, and small hot peppers of many colors, and amaranth with its tall red plumes, and beds of epazote and other fragrant herbs. There are flowers too, bright marigolds for the temples and the household altars, and white frangipani blossoms whose names would fill a whole separate story. In another corner, a small bed of seedlings waits to be transplanted. The farmers here have discovered a technique that would astonish any modern gardener. They take the rich, damp mud from the bottom of the canal, shape it into small cubes, press a seed into each cube, and let them sit together in a sheltered nursery area. When the seeds sprout and the little cubes have grown firm with tiny roots, the farmer simply carries them, cube and all, to the main bed and sets them gently into the soil. The plants never feel a moment of transplant shock. They grow on as if they had never been moved. It is a small, quiet miracle, repeated every day along the Chinampas of the lake. Now, as the first pale light begins to soften the eastern sky, the farmer comes down to the water. He is a man who has tended this plot since he was a boy, and before him his father tended it, and before his father his grandfather. He walks softly. He wears a simple white tunic of woven cotton, loose and cool, and a cloak tied at one shoulder, and sandals woven from the fibers of the maguey plant. At his side, leaning against the edge of the canal, is his canoe, long and low, carved from a single trunk, dark from many years of use. Beside the canoe lies his paddle, and a woven basket and a digging stick, and a small gourd for drinking water. He steps down into the canoe with the ease of a man who has done this every morning of his life, and he pushes off softly from the willow root and begins to glide. The canal is narrow, just wide enough for his canoe to pass, and the water is glass smooth in the stillness of early morning. He dips his paddle without a sound. The Chinampa on either side is his, but further on there are others, belonging to his cousins and his neighbors. The whole lakescape is knit together by family ties and shared labor. He knows every plot by name and every owner and which crops are planted where. As he paddles, he leans over and scoops up a handful of the dark mud from the bottom of the canal, and he lays it gently upon the bed to add another thin layer of richness to the soil. This is a daily task, and a small one, but over a year or a lifetime or a generation, it keeps the Chinampa alive and fertile forever. There is no exhaustion of the soil here. There is only the slow, steady renewal that comes from the lake itself, from the decomposing leaves, from the gentle gift of the water. A chinampa, well tended, can give 4, 5, even 7 harvests a year, and it can do so for centuries without ever tiring. As the farmer paddles further along his canal, other canoes begin to appear in the soft gray light. Another man is already at work transplanting seedlings into a freshly prepared bed. A woman is carrying flowers in a basket, perhaps cutting marigolds for the market that will open later in the morning. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, stands at the prow of his father's canoe, learning to balance and to read the water. They greet one another softly, with a nod or a word in Nahuatl, the rolling and musical language of the Mexica. And then they paddle on, and the canals fill slowly with life, as they have every morning for as long as anyone can remember. By the time the sun has risen fully over the eastern mountains, the whole of the lakescape is awake. From high above, one would see the Valley of Mexico spread out like an enormous mosaic of green and blue. The great mass of Lake Texcoco would stretch across the center, its brackish waters catching the morning light. The city of Tenochtitlan would rise from its midst, an island of temples and whitewashed houses, ringed by the pale stone of its causeways. Around the edges of the city, and along the southern shores of the lake, the chinampas would form an intricate quilt of narrow rectangular beds, thousands upon thousands of them, each separated by a thin line of water like the stitching between pieces of cloth. It is said that at its greatest extent, the chinampa system fed, together with tribute from the outer provinces, a population that historians have estimated at around 200,000 souls, making the city one of the largest in the world at that time. 200,000 people in a city where almost everyone traveled by canoe. Let us consider what that must have looked like in the brightening hours of a market day. The waterways of Tenochtitlan were laid out in a loose grid, with a few main canals running wide and deep, and countless smaller ones branching off to every neighborhood and every house. The main canals were wide enough for the largest cargo canoes, some of which carried tribute goods to the palace of Moctezuma, and some of which bore great stone sculptures for the temples. The smaller ones were narrow and winding, like the lanes of a watery village. There were also bridges, many of them movable, made of heavy wooden beams laid across the gaps so that people on foot could cross over the canals. And along the outer edges of the city, 3 great raised causeways of stone and earth led out across the lake to the mainland. These causeways were broad enough, according to the Spanish chroniclers who would later see them, for 10 horses to ride abreast. The causeways also served as dikes, helping to separate the fresh water of the western and southern parts of the lake from the salty water of the east. Without those dikes, the salt would have crept into the chinampas and poisoned the soil. With them, the farmers could tend their crops in water that remained sweet. Moving through the canals in the middle hours of the morning, one would pass a constant, gentle traffic of small boats. Here came a fisherman with his narrow dugout, a net piled in the bow, and a few small fish and frogs from the edges of the reeds. There went a young woman, her canoe loaded high with bundles of squash blossoms and green tomatoes, on her way to the vast marketplace of Tlatelolco. Behind her paddled an old man in no hurry, carrying a pot of honey and a few small cages of tame birds, whose feathers would be sold to the craftsmen who made ceremonial headdresses. A child glided by with her mother, clutching a small carved wooden toy. A priest, wrapped in a long dark cloak, moved with quiet purpose toward one of the smaller temples. The canoes passed one another with soft courtesy, and the paddles dipped in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, almost like the breathing of a great calm animal. The loudest sound of the morning was often only the splash of a fish, or the cry of a pelican, or the soft murmur of voices from a distant chinampa. The people who lived along these canals were of many kinds. There were the farmers, the chinamperos, who spent their days tending the floating gardens. There were the fisher folk, who knew every shallow and every deep hole. There were weavers and potters, feather workers and lapidaries, sculptors who carved gods out of basalt, and goldsmiths who worked the precious yellow metal brought in tribute from distant provinces. There were scribes who painted the histories of the city in bright colors on long folded books of fig bark paper. There were midwives and healers and teachers who worked at the schools where the children of the city learned the arts of their ancestors. There were mothers grinding maize on stone metates, and grandmothers keeping watch over the youngest children beneath the shade of a cotton awning. There were merchants called pachteca, who journeyed to faraway lands and came back with jade and cacao and the bright green feathers of the quetzal bird. All of them, in their own ways, were kept alive by the chinampas and the canals and the patient green world that surrounded them. Let us follow a canoe through the waterways toward one of the great markets of the city. The sun has climbed higher, and its warmth now rests gently on the white walls of the houses and on the soft feathers of the birds that wade along the reeds. The man who is paddling is a grower of flowers, a Xochimilco, and his chinampa lies a little to the south of the main island. His canoe is loaded with baskets of flowers that he cut in the hour before dawn, when the petals were still cool. There are marigolds, the bright orange Xochimilco, the flower of festivals in temples and household altars. There are white flowers of the frangipani, whose fragrance is so sweet that a single bloom can perfume an entire room. There are dahlias, wild and red, native to these mountains and beloved of every gardener in the valley. And there are orchids and lilies, and small woven bundles of fragrant herbs tied up in strings of reed. The flower grower paddles through the canals with his cargo, and the smell of his canoe drifts ahead of him in a sweet cloud, so that the children on the bank smell him coming and laugh with delight. He passes under a wooden bridge. He turns down a broader canal. He passes the edge of a small neighborhood temple, where a priest is sweeping the courtyard with a broom of twigs. He passes a potter's workshop, and through the open door, he can see the rows of new clay jars drying in the sun. He passes a school where a group of boys is reciting verses, their young voices rising and falling in the old rhythms. And at last, he comes to the great market of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco was the twin city of Tenochtitlan, a little to the north, joined to it so completely that in later years they were considered a single urban area. It held the largest marketplace in all of Mesoamerica, a plaza so vast that the Spanish soldiers who later described it struggled to find words. They said that tens of thousands of people came to it every day, from every corner of the empire and beyond. They said that it was laid out with such neat organization that each category of goods had its own section. One could find whole avenues devoted to pottery, and others to fish, and others to fruit and vegetables, and others to cotton and cloth, and still others to medicinal herbs, and to gold and jade, and to the bright feathers of birds from the jungle lowlands far to the south. Judges and scribes watched over the proceedings, so that weights were honest and disputes were settled quickly. Cacao beans served as a kind of small currency, along with bundles of cotton cloth, and for larger purchases there were little quills filled with gold dust. But the whole of the market was conducted without shouting, without rushing, in the same measured rhythm as the canoes on the canals. Our flower grower unloads his baskets in the section reserved for flowers, where the air is already thick and sweet. Around him, other growers are arranging their blossoms in careful mounds. A priest buys a large bundle of marigolds for the offerings of the afternoon. A young man buys a single white frangipani bloom, perhaps to tuck into the hair of a beloved. An old woman buys a small bouquet of dahlias to place before the little clay figure of her ancestor in her household shrine. The flower grower smiles and nods and accepts his payment of cacao beans with a quiet bow. And in the next lane, a merchant of dried chilies is doing the same. And in the lane beyond, a seller of tomatoes. And in the lane beyond that, a man selling the flat, dry cakes of a remarkable green food, harvested from the surface of the lake itself, a kind of nutritious algae the Mexica called Tlatelolco, which was dried in the sun and pressed into thin cakes and eaten almost like bread. From the market, our imagination drifts back across the canals, back to the Chinampas in the soft middle of the day. By now the sun is high, and the lake's surface is brighter than glass, and a gentle breeze moves across the valley from the direction of the mountains. The farmer whose canoe we followed at dawn has long since returned to his garden, and he is now kneeling among his young plants, inspecting the leaves for any sign of trouble. The Chinampas, despite their lushness, are remarkably free of pests. The constant moisture keeps the soil cool and healthy. The diversity of crops, all growing together, discourages any single insect from overwhelming any single species. The willows along the edges provide homes for birds, and the birds eat the caterpillars and the beetles, and the balance holds as it has for generations. Here and there, a frog leaps from the canal onto a leaf and watches the farmer with solemn eyes, and then leaps away. A dragonfly hovers above the water, its wings catching the sun in flashes of iridescent blue. An axolotl, the small, strange salamander of these lakes, with its feathery gills and its faint smile, drifts through the shallows beneath a chinampa and then disappears into the dark. The farmer works without hurry. He pulls a few small weeds and tosses them into the canal, where they will drift and rot and eventually become part of the next layer of mud that is dredged up to feed the garden. He straightens a leaning stalk of maize. He checks the moisture of the soil with his fingertips and finds it perfect, because the water from the canal has been seeping gently upward through the earth all morning, keeping the roots of every plant in a constant embrace of cool dampness. This was one of the great quiet secrets of the Chinampa. The farmer did not have to carry water to his crops, because the water came up to the crops of its own accord. He did not have to fertilize them with any effort, because the mud he dredged up every few days was already full of nutrients from the lake itself. He did not have to rest the land, because the land was constantly being renewed. Compared to the hard, dry fields of the uplands, where a farmer might work from sunrise to sunset just to coax a single harvest out of thin soil, the Chinampa was a place of abundance. In the middle of the day, the farmer paused to eat. He sat beneath the shade of his willow trees, and he opened a small, woven cloth bundle that his wife had prepared for him that morning. Inside were a few warm tortillas of maize, wrapped around beans, and perhaps a small green chili, and perhaps a piece of grilled fish from the lake, or a portion of dried algae pressed into a cake. He drank from his gourd, which held water that had been boiled the night before with a sprig of mint. He ate slowly, looking out over the glittering water, watching the distant silhouette of the great temple pyramid rising over the rooftops of Tenochtitlan, its twin shrines painted bright blue and bright red, visible for many miles in every direction. Then he finished his meal and wrapped up his cloth and returned to his garden, because there were always small tasks to do, and the light was still good, and the green plants were still growing. As the afternoon deepened, other sounds began to move across the water. From a nearby Chinampa came the soft laughter of a woman weaving, her loom tied between two posts and strapped around her waist, her fingers pulling the bright threads through the warp with the practiced ease of long habit. From another Chinampa came the sound of a boy practicing on a small clay flute, his notes thin and sweet, wavering a little as he found his way through a familiar song. From yet another came the steady rhythmic patting of hands on dough, as an older woman shaped tortillas for the evening meal, her palms quick and sure. These were the common sounds of the Aztec lakescape, the quiet music of many lives unfolding in parallel, each family tending its own garden, its own small and cherished routines, all of them held together by the soft embrace of the water. We should speak now of the great quiet engineering that made all of this possible, because without it, the Chinampas could never have flourished. When the Mexica first began to expand their city and their gardens, the lake was a difficult master. In the rainy season, the water could rise suddenly and dramatically, flooding the young Chinampas and washing their soil away. In the dry season, the water could recede and leave the gardens parched at the edges. And always, there was the danger of the salt. Because Lake Texcoco had no outlet, its waters grew saltier in the center and to the east, and if that salty water ever reached the Chinampas, it would poison them. The greatest single project was the dike of Nezahualcoyotl. It was built in the middle of the 15th century, under the shared leadership of the Mexica and their close ally, the philosopher King Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco. It stretched for about 16 kilometers across the lake, from north to south, a long earthen wall reinforced with wooden stakes and stone, held together by the patient labor of thousands of workers. Its purpose was simple and profound. It separated the western half of the lake, which surrounded Tenochtitlan and its Chinampas, from the eastern half, which remained salty. Once the dike was in place, the water around the city grew sweeter, because the springs and the rains could flush it clean without being mixed with the brackish water beyond. The Chinampas flourished as never before. The dike also had gates that could be opened and closed to manage the flow of water during floods, like a quiet system of locks. It was a masterpiece of engineering, built without iron tools, without horses, without any draft animal stronger than a man's back. It was built by human patience in stone and wood, and the slow accumulation of countless careful days. Besides the dike, there were also the aqueducts. The water of the lake itself was not ideal for drinking. The Mexica wanted clean spring water for their city, and so they built long stone channels to carry it in from the hills. The most famous of these was the aqueduct of Chapultepec, which ran along the top of one of the causeways and brought fresh water from the springs at the foot of the hill of Chapultepec into the heart of the city. The aqueduct had two parallel channels, so that one could be closed off for cleaning, while the other continued to flow. By day, canoes loaded with gourds and jars would paddle along to collect drinking water, and by night, the city slept beneath the steady murmur of running springs. It was said that Tenochtitlan was one of the cleanest cities in the world at that time. 1,000 workers swept the streets every day. There were public latrines placed at regular intervals along the causeways, and the waste was carefully collected because it was valuable as fertilizer for the Chinampas. Nothing was wasted. The lake fed the gardens fed the city returned its waste to the gardens, and the gardens fed the lake again. It was a way of living that modern thinkers in our own day look back upon with a kind of quiet astonishment. Let us drift now toward the softer hours of the afternoon. Near the center of Tenochtitlan, behind the great walls of the sacred precinct, lay the palaces of the rulers. The palace of Moctezuma the Younger was a vast compound of many courtyards and many rooms, built of stone and beautifully painted in white and soft earth colors. Within the palace, there were gardens unlike any others. These were not the practical chinampas of the farmers, but pleasure gardens, laid out for the quiet delight of the royal family. There were paths of smooth stone that wound among carefully chosen trees. There were pools of water, fed by small channels from the aqueduct, in which floated lilies. There were aviaries, great wooden structures filled with the songs of many birds, from the bright little hummingbirds of the highlands to the long-tailed quetzals, whose feathers had been brought as tribute from the misty forests of the south. Dedicated keepers tended the birds, feeding them by hand, speaking softly to them. The royal children would sometimes wander in these gardens at dusk, watching the keepers at their work, learning the names of the birds and the songs of the flowers. Near the palace, there were also the botanical gardens of the city, in which plants from every corner of the empire were gathered for study. The Mexica were attentive observers of the natural world, and their knowledge of medicinal plants was extensive. A sick person might be treated with the leaves of one plant for a fever, the bark of another for a cough, the root of a third for pain. The healers who cared for the people used this knowledge with care, and they passed it on through long years of apprenticeship. The scribes could sit at the edge of a flower bed and paint careful illustrations of each plant on sheets of bark paper, labeling them with their names in Nahuatl and noting their uses. Some of these illustrated books survived into later centuries, and from them, we know something of what those gardens contained. Beyond the palaces, there was the sacred hill of Chapultepec, which stood just a little to the west of the city on the mainland. Chapultepec was an old and beloved place, crowned by great cypress trees so ancient that the Mexica believed their spirits had been witnesses to the first days of the world. At the foot of the hill, clear springs poured from the rock, and these were the springs that fed the aqueduct. The rulers of Tenochtitlan often came to Chapultepec to rest, and they built small pavilions and pools among the trees. On certain days of festival, priests and musicians would gather at the springs, and the soft sound of the flutes and the quiet voices of the songs would rise among the cypresses. It is said that some of those ancient cypress trees are still standing, 5 centuries later, in what is now a great park in the middle of a modern city. Their roots are still drinking from the same water that once flowed to the gardens of Tenochtitlan. Their branches still stir in the same highland wind. The hours of the afternoon in Tenochtitlan pass like the hours on any great body of still water. The light changed slowly, softening as the sun moved toward the western mountains. The Chinampas became green and gold in the long rays. The canoes moved more gently, as if the whole valley had agreed to slow its pace. Inside the houses, mothers prepared the evening meal. The smell of cooking drifted out over the water, mingling with the scent of flowers and the faint smoke of the small cooking fires. Tortillas hissed on the flat clay griddles called comals. Beans simmered in clay pots. A sauce was ground from tomatoes and chilies, and a little salt on the ancient stone malkaji. The families of the Chinamperos ate simply, but they ate well. Their meals were full of the things their own gardens had produced that week, fresh and green, and tasting of the water and the soil. As the sun began to set, the priests in the sacred precinct climbed the steps of the great temple to greet the evening. Their chants rose thin and clear into the sky. The low drums beat softly, slower now than at midday, almost like the heartbeat of a sleeping body. Below them, the city slowly grew quiet. The canoes returned home, one by one, each to its own landing along its own canal. The last of the flower sellers packed up her baskets. The last of the fishermen hauled in his nets. On the Chinampas, the farmers gathered their tools and walked back along the narrow earth paths between the garden beds, their day's work done. Children called to one another from the bridges, their voices small and happy in the gathering dusk. Somewhere far off, a single flute played a long, slow melody whose name no one remembered anymore. The sky turned pink and then purple, and then the deep, soft blue of the night. By the time the stars came out, the lake and its city had entered the quietest part of the day. A few small torches flickered at the doorways of houses and at the corners of the causeways. The water reflected the starlight, and the long line of the Milky Way stretched across the sky above the valley. The great temple pyramids were dark silhouettes against the last soft glow of the horizon. The air smelled of wood smoke and cooked maize, and the faint sweetness of the flowers in the Chinampas. A single canoe, belonging perhaps to a late-returning merchant, made its slow way down a central canal, its paddle dipping softly. The ripples spread outward in gentle rings and touched the roots of the willow trees, and the willow trees whispered in the almost still air. Consider the axolotl, that strange and gentle creature of these waters. The axolotl is a salamander that never quite grows up, keeping its feathery gills and its water-dwelling form throughout its life. Its face seems to hold a small, permanent smile, and its skin can be pale pink or dark gray or spotted, and it hovers in the shallows of the lake with a patience that seems almost meditative. The Mexica knew the axolotl well. They told stories about it, and they saw in it a kind of small holy being. The axolotl was endemic to this place, and only this place, and for centuries it lived in the canals and beneath the chinampas, slipping among the roots of the water lilies. Some of its descendants still survive in the remaining canals of Xochimilco today, though they are rare now and carefully protected. To imagine one of them, on a summer afternoon long ago, drifting beneath the shadow of a maize plant in a chinampa near the city, its little gills stirring softly in the current, is to touch something very gentle and very old. Consider also the birds. The lakes of the Valley of Mexico were, in that time, one of the greatest gatherings of waterfowl in the Americas. Ducks of many kinds, both resident and migratory, filled the reeds in their uncountable thousands. In the autumn, when the birds from the north arrived to spend the winter in the mild Mexican highlands, the surface of the water would sometimes seem almost to disappear beneath the soft carpet of feathers. Herons and egrets stood in the shallows on their long, quiet legs. Pelicans sailed overhead in long lines. Cormorants dove from the reeds. Children watched them from the edges of the gardens. Hunters came in their canoes at dawn with nets and light spears, and took only what their families would eat that day. The great flocks rose with a sound like many hands clapping, and they circled above the lake, and they settled again. Consider also the simple beauty of a Mexica house at night, in one of the neighborhoods along the quieter canals. The house is low and rectangular, built of adobe brick and whitewashed until it glows softly in the moonlight. Its roof is flat, with beams of wood and a layer of clay above, and sometimes on the rooftop there is a small garden in a clay pot. The house has 1 or 2 rooms, with a small open courtyard in the middle. In the courtyard, there is a fire pit, now glowing only with the last embers of the evening meal. There is a stone metate where the mother grinds her maize. There is a loom leaning against the wall. There is a household altar with a simple clay figure of a household god, and in front of it a cup of water and a few petals of marigold, and perhaps a single thin wisp of copal incense whose perfume still hangs in the air. The family has laid out their sleeping mats of woven reed on the earthen floor. The grandmother is already asleep, her breathing slow and quiet. The children are curling against one another, their small hands clasped. The father and mother sit awake a little longer, talking in low voices about the garden, and about a cousin who is coming to visit, and about a festival that is only a few days away. Then they too lie down and the house falls silent. Outside, the night is soft and full of stars. A single frog calls from the canal. A distant owl answers from the trees. And the Chinampas, unseen in the darkness, go on quietly holding their promise of tomorrow's green. Time itself was understood differently in Tenochtitlan than it is today. The Mexica kept two great calendars, which turned together like the wheels of a patient machine. One was the solar year of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days. The other was a sacred calendar of 260 days, made by combining 20 named day signs with the numbers 1 through 13. These two calendars interlocked and only came back to the same position once every 52 years. In between these great turnings, the rhythm of ordinary days flowed softly from festival to festival, from planting season to harvest, from the rainy months to the dry ones. The Chinamparos, more than anyone, lived within these rhythms, because their whole world was a garden, and a garden is always, by its nature, a living calendar. They knew when the rains would come, and when the waters would rise, and when the first young maize would be ready to pull, and when the marigolds would bloom for the autumn festivals. On the night of a festival, the Chinampas themselves became part of the celebration. Canoes would be decorated with flowers, and their prows would carry small woven images of the gods of maize and of the water. The canals would be full of soft lanterns. The whole city would smell of copal incense and tortillas fresh from the comal. Music would drift from the courtyards. There would be gentle dances in which old people and young people moved together in quiet lines, their feet soft upon the hard-packed earth. There would be poetry recited by men who had studied it since childhood, poetry about the flowers and about the shortness of life, poetry whose phrases compared the human soul to a hummingbird, and the days of a person to the petals that fall from a dahlia. A surprising amount of this poetry was later written down, and some of it survives even now. In one poem, the poet writes that the earth is only lent to us for a little while, and that we must enjoy the flowers while we can. And yet, when we think of the Chinampas, perhaps what is most beautiful is not even the poetry, or the festivals, or the great engineering works. Perhaps it is the smallest, most ordinary moments. A mother teaching her daughter how to press a seed into a cube of canal mud. A grandfather showing a grandson how to weave a mat of reed for the edge of a new garden. A woman humming as she pulls a ripe tomato from its stem, the red fruit warm in her palm. A young man sliding his canoe noiselessly through the reeds at dusk, watching a white heron lift off and settle again a little further down the water. A small child dipping his toes into the canal for the first time, laughing at the coolness of it, his mother's steady hand at his shoulder. These moments were repeated endlessly across all the Chinampas and all the canals and all the generations. They were small, quiet acts of care, performed by people who knew their place in the slow turning of water and season and light. The world that we have been drifting through tonight was not, of course, to last forever. But the green and watery life of the Chinampas did not entirely vanish. Even after the lakes were drained, even after the canals were filled in and paved over with stone streets, a few pockets of the old world remained. In the south, where Lake Xochimilco had been fed by the clearest springs, some of the Chinampas survived. Farmers there kept tending their floating beds, year after year, generation after generation, long after the empire that had once ringed them with temples and causeways was gone. They grew maize and beans and squash. They grew cilantro and lettuce and parsley. They grew marigolds and dahlias. They paddled small, flat-bottomed boats down the old canals, just as their ancestors had, and they passed beneath the old willow trees, and they dredged the old mud, and they sang the old songs. Today, if you were to visit the canals of Xochimilco on a quiet morning, you would see something like a living echo of the Aztec lakescape. You would see narrow, rectangular gardens, still productive, still watered from the canals, still bordered by willows whose roots run deep into the mud. You would see the green of maize and the orange of marigolds, and the soft purple of jacaranda blossoms drifting from the trees. You would see dragonflies hovering, and perhaps, if you were lucky, a glimpse of an axolotl in the shallows. You would see small boats moving slowly along the water, carrying flowers and vegetables to the markets of the city, just as they did 500 years ago. You would hear the dip of a paddle, and the distant voices of farmers, and the soft murmur of water against the edge of the beds. And perhaps that is the gentlest thing of all about the story of the floating gardens. They were never only about food. They were never only about engineering. They were about a way of living with the land and the water that understood patience and reciprocity and the slow green miracle of things that grow. They were about a people who looked at a swampy island in a brackish lake and saw, not a problem, but a home. They were about generations of quiet hands building up mud, weaving reeds, planting willows, dredging canals, feeding the soil with the soil itself, asking nothing more of the earth than what the earth could gently give. For hundreds of years, the Chinampas of the Valley of Mexico fed a great city without exhausting its lake, without poisoning its water, without forgetting the small fish and the small birds and the small salamanders who lived among the roots of the crops. And when the people had finished their day's work, they paddled softly home through canals lit by stars, and they slept in houses that smelled of flowers, and they dreamed, we can imagine, of the next morning's soft light on the soft green fields. So let us rest now as they rested. Let us feel the slow, imagined movement of a canoe beneath us. Let us hear the distant murmur of the aqueduct, and the faint call of a sleepy bird, and the whisper of willow leaves above the water. Let us breathe in the clean, cool air of the highland valley, carrying the scent of damp earth and simple Xochitl flowers. The city on the lake is sleeping. The Chinampas are sleeping, their roots drinking quietly from the water beneath them. The willows are sleeping, their leaves still at last. The axolotl in the shallows is sleeping, its small smile fixed in the soft dark of the canal. The great pyramids are silhouettes against a sky full of stars that have not changed their patterns in 500 years. Somewhere, a single torch flickers and goes out. Somewhere, a flute sings one last note and then falls silent. Somewhere, a mother draws a cotton blanket over her small sleeping child and whispers a soft word and settles herself on her own mat of woven reed. And the lake holds all of them, gently, as it has held them through the long years of this quiet hour. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us at the Bedtime Lore, drifting among the Chinampas of Tenochtitlan. May the soft rhythm of their canals carry you now into your own warm rest, and may the distant whisper of willow leaves follow you gently into dreams. Close your eyes a little deeper. Let your shoulders settle. Let the story drift away, just as a canoe drifts away across still water at the end of a long, peaceful day. The gardens are tended. The city is sleeping. The stars are turning slowly above the valley. Rest well now, and let these ancient echoes carry you softly into dreams. Good night.